the Kenya dairy sector has changed radically over the last 15 years. And it was actually one of DFID's very first, what is now known as a market systems development project. Back then, it was a business services market development project. And around the table, we have the people who actually did that, who put it together. We have Colin Zapoyo, who was the DFID project officer in charge of supervising it. We have Kevin Billings, who was the team leader for the program that ran it. And then we have Harun Baya, who was the main facilitator, who really did a lot of the work. And Harun, being a Kenyan working in Kenya, is with his same organization that has been continued working in the sector since 2001. So he has really had the in-depth tracking and is probably known by more Kenyan dairy people than any other person, and is accredited with really helping to transform the sector. And so this is going to be the story of how the sector has transformed. And it's really, a lot of our work tends to be focused on services, helping a company do more sales or helping a linkage. But this is really a tale of regulatory change. By working with the regulator and getting the regulations changed, that actually led to the major driver of this transformation of the sector. And it's a very impressive story. And my role in all of this was that I did the initial analysis on the project. I had the design. I then had the pleasure of coming in 7 years later and doing the evaluation, and then have been working with the sector every year, in particular with Harun, and tracking the results over the years. So we actually have 15 years of data, which is really pretty amazing to see how something's been working, especially since there have been so many other projects that have jumped in and jumped out without looking at the history, understanding where it came from. The project, well, the first project ended in 2008. Harun got a second small project, which he ran till 2010. DFID, in the meantime, has spent 10 times more money on other activities in the sector with much less impact because they didn't look at the same parts of it. And so there are currently very large projects spending millions of pounds assisting the dairy sector. But what we'll see is that it actually didn't take that much money. So as I was saying, this is a story of transformation. The industry has changed quite a bit. We've had a formalization of the informal sector. And so we'll see how that actually happened. But most importantly, what we're interested in is, if it's about poverty, the sector has been growing steadily both in numbers of participants, particularly at the smallholder poor level, the volumes of product flowing through, the quality of the milk from a food safety standpoint has increased, and income has increased. This growth has been driven by the informal sector. And we'll see that story, and we'll hear the people who did it. But the transformation has been led by government policy. But it was facilitated by these two projects. And the roles that these two projects played are really kind of taking a non-traditional approach, really had a major impact. One was the DFID Business Services Market Development Program, which was one of DFID's first projects, and Collins will talk a little bit about that as we get into it. And then Harun was running a DFID Governance Challenge Grant. So it's interesting, it was actually a governance challenge grant that led to many of the major changes. So we'll be looking through the initial analysis, implementation approaches, and changes. But just to set the scene, Jim was also talking about industrial strategy and understanding how a sector grows. So when we did the initial analysis, we laid out the structure of the industry, the markets, who was there. We identified how many people there were in the sector and who they were working with. What were the relationships? And we really found that there were 4 different channels. But at the bottom of it, you had over 600,000 smallholder producers. But they were selling through a wide range of different players. And we have large dairies involved. We have lots of informal traders selling raw milk to the market. We had a number of small dairies selling cheese and yogurt, but not selling milk. But these 4 channels were really driving, were the basic relationships between the market actors. But what we were most interested in were the bottom group, 625,000 smallholder farmers. Very important, you look at the prices that were being sold at the market level, 27 to 30 shillings if you were buying raw milk. So this is warm milk being sold directly to households. Or if you bought pasteurized milk, it was 50 to 52 shillings a liter. What do you think that meant for the poor consumers? Which milk do you think they preferred to purchase? Well, they actually much preferred to purchase the raw milk. So the total amount of milk being commercialized in Kenya in 2001, only about 200 million liters was going through the formal dairies. 700 million liters was being delivered direct to households and to milk bars through the informal traders. And 35% was being sold directly just kind of at the rural level between producers and their neighbors. So out of 1.4 billion liters of milk being sold, 1.2 billion was in the raw milk sector. But guess what? Raw milk is illegal. It's illegal to sell raw milk. In 2001, it was illegal to sell raw milk in Kenya. But it was happening. And so the question was, how do you really take this group that are handling more than 50% of all the milk, but who are being penalized by the regulatory environment? And who do we think is supporting and pushing the regulatory environment? Well, those large dairies on the right. They're out there saying, make it illegal, stop them, arrest them. And the question really was, well, if 85% of the milk is going through the informal sector, why are we putting all of our emphasis on the large dairies that have so much power in the relationship? They sit, the first time I met the head of the Kenya Dairy Board, Mr. Kenyatta, who's the owner of the largest dairy in the country, happened to be there. It was a very pleasant meeting. We had a great meeting. But you know who has lunch with the head of the regulatory body and who doesn't. And there was a very conflictual relationship between the two sides. So just some of the main constraints. We said, well, how are we going to, what could a project do? What should a project do to help figure out how to really affect that area where 85% of the milk that was being marketed was going? Because if they had made it absolutely illegal for the raw milk to be sold, prices were much higher, right? A lot of the demand would have fallen off, and a lot of those smallholder farmers would have been put out of business. So some of the main issues that the project was looking at to confront, food safety was a very important one. We've already talked about the fact that the informal trade of raw milk was illegal, and but it was happening. So what did that mean? Transaction costs were high. They were constantly being stopped by the health department, the police department. They were being fined, their vehicles were being seized, their milk cans were being taken away, or they'd just be held for a couple of days, the milk would spoil. Very high transactions costs. It was actually leading to a great increase. The regulator was definitely influenced by the large dairies, but they also had a couple of other issues. They didn't have much money from the government. Since 80% of the milk was being sold through informal channels, and their revenue was coming from collecting taxes on milk that was sold, they were missing out on revenue from 80% of all milk. And they didn't know how to regulate. It turned out there were 30,000 traders. How, as a regulator, do you regulate 30,000 people that you don't know who they are, where they are? These were some of the issues. And then there were issues on image for the raw milk traders. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Kevin, who was confronted with this situation and trying to figure out, well, what do we do? And how do we do it? And remember, this was 2003, so 2002, end of 2002. These projects, this was one of the first projects. So Kevin, over to you.